Welcome back to Hebrews Story Hour, reading Ruth 4 this morning. Verse 1. Uvoaz Allah hasha'ar vayeshiv sham v'hine hagoel over asher deber Boaz vayomer surah shiva po poloni almoni vayasar vayeshev. Verse 2, Vayikach asara anashim mizikne ha'ir, vayomer shuvu po, vayeshevu. Let's translate those two verses. Now, Boaz went up to the gate, and he sat there, and behold, and look, the Redeemer was passing by, about whom Boaz had spoken. And he said, "Turn aside, sit here, Mr. So-and-so." And he turned aside and he sat. And he took 10 men from the elders of the city, and he said, "Sit here." And they sat down. Verse 3, Vayomer lagoel chelkat hasadeh asher la'achinu la'imelech makara Naomi hashava misde Moab. Verse 4, Va'ani amarti egle oznecha lemor kine neged ha-yoshavim v'neged zikne ami im tigal gaal v'im lo yigal hagida li v'eda ki ein zulatecha ligol v'anochi acharecha v'yomer anochi egla or egal. Okay, translating 3 and 4 now. Verse 3. And he said to the Redeemer, "The portion of the land which belongs to our brother, that is Elimelech, Naomi is selling, the one who returned from the field of Moab. And I myself said, I will uncover your ear, saying, purchase or acquire before the one sitting down, before the elders of my people. If you will redeem, redeem. If he will not redeem, tell me or declare to me, so that I might know, because there is no other except for you to redeem, and I am after you." And he said, "I myself will redeem." Verse 5, Vayomer Boaz, V'yom kinotecha hasadeh miyad Naomi ume'et Ruth hamoaviyah eshet hamet kanita lehakim shem hamet al nachalato. Verse 6, Vayomer hagoel lo uchal ligol li pen ashchit et nachalati ga'alecha ata et geulati ki lo uchal ligol. Verse 5, translating. Now Boaz said, "On the day that you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, also Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the one who died, you have acquired, to raise up a name of the dead one over his inheritance." And the Redeemer said, "I'm not able to redeem for myself, lest I ruin my inheritance. Redeem for yourself, you, my right of redemption, because I'm not able to redeem." Verse 7, V'zot lefanim b'Yisrael al hageulah v'al hatmura lekayem kol devar shalaf ish na'alo v'natan l're'ehu v'zot hateudah b'Yisrael. Verse 8, Vayomer Hagoel leVoaz Kenei lach v'yashlof na'alo. Yishlof na'alo. Okay, translating verse 7. Now this, and we have to supply here, I think this was the custom before in Israel about the right of redemption and concerning the exchange. To confirm the word, a man would take off his sandal and he would give it to his neighbor. And this was the testimony in Israel. And the Redeemer said to Boaz, acquire for yourself. And he took off his sandal. Verse 9. Vayomer Boaz Lazakinim v'chol ha'am edim atem hayom ki kaniti et kol asher leElimelech ve'et kol asher lechilyon u'machlon miyad Naomi. Verse 10. V'gam et Ruth haMoaviyah eshet machlon kaniti li leisha L'hakim shem hamet al nachalato, v'lo yikaret shem hamet me'im echav, u'misha'ar mikomo edim atem hayom. Verse 11, Vayomeru kol ha'am asher ba'sha'ar v'hazakenim edim. Yitain Adonai et ha'isha haba'a el beitcha kerachel u'kaleah asher banu shtehem et beit Yisrael va'aseh chayil be'efrata u'karashem beveit lachem. Verse 12. Vihi beitcha kaveit peretz, asher yalada tamar lihuda, min hazera asher yitain Adonai lecha, min hana'ara hazot. Okay, now we're going back all the way to verse 9 to translate. And Boaz said to the elders and everyone, or all of the people, you are witnesses today that I have acquired everything that belonged to Elimelech, and also, and everything which was to Chilion and Machlon from the hand of Naomi, and also Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Machlon, I have acquired for myself as a wife, to raise up the name of the dead over his inheritance. And it will not be cut off, and the name of the dead one shall not be cut off from among his brothers, or from the gate of his place. You are witnesses today. Verse 11, all the people said, or all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, witnesses. In other words, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and like Leah, the two of whom built, or who built, the two of them, the house of Israel, and do valorously. We'll come back to that. Act with valor, lost my place now. There we go. In Ephratah, and call a name in Bethlehem. Verse 12, may your house be like the house of parrots, to whom Tamar bore whom Tamar bore to Judah, from the seed which the Lord may give to you from this young woman. Okay, and then in verse 13, reading the Hebrew. Vayikach Boaz et Ruth vatihi lo leisha, vayavo elecha, vayitzin Adonai la herayon vateled bain. Verse 14. Vatomar na hanashim el Naomi, Baruch Adonai, asher lo hishbit lach goel hayom, vayikare shemo b'Yisrael. Verse 15. V'haya lach lemeshiv nefesh, u'lechalkel et sevatech ki chalatek, asher ahevatech yiladatu, asher ki tova lach mishiva banim. Verse 16, Vatikach Naomi et hayeled, Vatishitehu v'cheka, Vatihi lo leomenet. And verse 17, Vatik rena lo hashechenot shem lemor, Yulad bain leNaomi, Vatik rena Shemo Oved, Hu Avi Yishai, Avi David. Okay, now going back to 13 to translate. Boaz took Ruth, and she became a wife, or his wife. And he entered into her, and the Lord gave to her pregnancy. And she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has restored," who has not stopped for you a redeemer, not kept a redeemer from you today. May his name be renowned in Israel. And it shall be, this is verse 15, and he shall be for you as one who restores life and who supports your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, has borne him, the one who is better for you than 7 sons. That's talking about Ruth there, not the son. Verse 16, and Naomi took the child, and she set him on her bosom, and she became a nurse, his nurse. And they called the women who resided, the women of the town, called a name for him, or named him, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Oved, for he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, now verse 18 to the end. Ve'ela toledot Paretz holid et Chetzron, veChetzron holid et Ram, veRam holid et Aminadav. Aminadav holid et Nachshon, veNachshon holid et Salma, veSalmon holid et Boaz, uVoaz holid et Oved, veOved holid et Yishai, veYishai holid et David. Thus ends the book of Ruth. Okay, so we'll open it up for your questions or reflections, any comments on the Hebrew or otherwise.
Do you think it's significant that the Redeemer is about the only person in this book that is not named? You think he just called a kinsman redeemer?
Yes, actually, and he is called in verse 1, Poloni Almoni, which I translated as Mr. So-and-so.
Yeah.
I think it's purposefully not naming him.
Yes.
You think about the characters that are named, as most of them in the book, prominent characters, even at the beginning of Machlon and Chilion, and especially Orpah and Ruth and Naomi, and that this guy plays a role. But I mean, there's two ways of taking that. One, kind of throwing shade at this guy because he's not going to step up and do what he ought to do. The other way of taking it is just that he's not important. He's sort of, what's really important is Boaz and what Boaz is doing for. So he's being contrasted with Boaz. I want to say that Polmoni Almoni occurs. I think I have a reference here. Yeah. Also, if you're interested, in 1 Samuel 21:3 and 2 Kings 6:8. I'm not sure the context of those texts, but an intentional non-naming. 1 Samuel 21:3 and 2 Kings 6:8. Other questions immediately here? We can sort of take this scene by scene, right? So it starts with Boaz. Boaz in chapter 3, Ruth was the one taking the actions, right? It was under the cover of night, and Boaz was sort of being, I mean, obviously he's an important character of that story, but he's sort of being acted upon. Now Boaz is acting as an agent. In the scenes, the setting is different. Like Ruth had to sort of hide, and it was at the threshing floor at night where it was just the two of them. But now it's a very public affair, and Boaz is acting with valor, just as Ruth did in chapter 3. Just kind of showing faithfulness, but in different settings.
I do have questions about chapter 4, but in this context of the threshing floor, it seemed to me that Boaz had taken the first step. When Boaz was a overly generous to this young woman. She comes in to harvest, everything's normal, but he calls her aside and gives her a whole bunch of grain.
Yeah.
As I'm reading that in English to my children in a nightly Bible study, we kind of add in some fan fiction to get the color for the kids. And I have the other hired hands around there looking at each other and kind of winking and saying, the boss has spotted the girl. Leave her alone. She belongs to the boss. You know, the generosity is a very definite flirting. Now, he's being polite about it. He's an old man. She's young and beautiful. But he's expressing with his generosity that he really thinks she's special.
Yeah.
Okay, and so there's this line where he's not crossing it to be inappropriate, but he's really expressing his appreciation for her. And so her the action she takes then, going to Naomi, what do I do? And Naomi gives her the advice, she goes and does it. She's the passive agent in this. She's the responsive one. The initiation of the relationship was with Boaz.
Yeah, they kind of flip flop because I mean that's chapter 2, right? In chapter 2, Ruth takes the initiative in some ways to care for Naomi, and she's the agent throughout the story of caring for Naomi. And then Boaz sort of jumps on that bandwagon. Boaz is especially caring for Ruth. So there's that kind of where Ruth takes the initiative to go to the field in the first place. So let me go out, and I think it is somewhat assertive in chapter 2, even though, yes, like Boaz, wants to demonstrate to Naomi that he's going to take care of them and it's a weird mix. Not a weird mix, maybe it's a very normal mix in some ways of sort of respectfully caring for each other, all of these characters, and also showing affection, like emotion. It's both. It's like Boaz and Ruth aren't just flirting with each other. It's not just a tryst. I mean, there's like, it's also like caring for the widow and the orphan, like sort of justice is all wrapped into it. It's just that's what makes this story so beautiful.
Totally wholesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to chapter 4 then, the other question that I had.
Okay.
Naomi takes up this baby Obed and puts the baby to her bosom, and she becomes his nurse.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like she is actually breastfeeding this baby. Like Naomi is actually breastfeeding the baby, which would mean that Naomi is herself no more than her 40s. She's a relatively young widow herself, and that adds all sorts of color to this. Am I misreading this word, becoming his nurse?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily means breastfeeding. I mean, to be a wet nurse would omit it here. I mean, she's certainly caring for him. And she does take him to her chek, which is lap, or you sometimes translate it bosom, but it's not breast. So I don't think it's super clear that she's breastfeeding him. Although, yes, and so in my view, she's not, but she is his nurse in the sense of caring for him, watching him. It's like, many multi-generational households where the grandparents take care of the children. So nurse in the sense of overseer, watching. But it is interesting, the relationship between the child and Naomi, right? And there's some, just to bring up, just start at the end here. If we go to, so it's the women of the city are also a character, right? They're involved. They were the ones who, when Naomi first came to Bethlehem, they said, "Could this be Naomi?" And she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitter." And now they're back, those same women, and they're sort of celebrating Naomi. They're celebrating the child. So Ruth has the baby, but as soon as she has the baby, verse 14, the women say to Naomi, so like Naomi's now the spotlighted one, and they bless the Lord in verse 14, because he hasn't stopped to you a redeemer today. Like the redeemer is Naomi's redeemer, and his name will be called, and it could be the Lord's name will be renowned, or the child's name will be renowned or be called in Israel. So the question is, who is Naomi's redeemer?
Yes.
It's not Boaz, it's the child, in my view, because then the child will be named and then the rest of the story is about the child, Naomi's redeemer, being named in Israel. And he will be the one who refreshes your soul to sustain you in your old age. It's possible to read all of these as references to Yahweh, blessed be the Lord. because he's going to do this for you. But it seems to be tangibly God's representative of all of this for Naomi is the Goel, that is the child. Because it goes on, well, then it talks about Ruth, which we could talk about how great Ruth is here, better than 7 sons. And then she takes the son, or the child. Then verse 17, the women of the city again, women of the town, name him. A child has been born, Yulad, to Naomi, right? So not to Ruth, but a child's been born to Naomi, and they name him Oved. Oved is a word play on Yulad. He's been born. Perhaps, but and then we get this. Well, I don't know if it is. It's not on Yulad. Anyway, it's the point here is that they name him. The women of the city name him, and recognize him as Naomi's son. So in the end, the argument's been made, and I think justifiably so, that Naomi we should call this book the book of Naomi.
Yeah.
Although I do think Ruth is the primary agent in this story. She's the hero or the heroine of this story. Naomi is the protagonist at the beginning and at the end. It's kind of her story. And in the end, it's not Ruth and Boaz, it's Naomi and Oved. So all to say is that they have not just a grandmother to child relationship, they really have a close, intimate relationship.
Mm-hmm. I could put in a plug as
Okay.
a Leleche League leader, helping moms and babies for 40 years. She very much could have nursed that baby.
Okay. Yeah, you know more about that than me.
It would have given them a very close tie.
Yeah. And age-wise, people die young. So it's not unreasonable that Naomi, we shouldn't probably picture as, a 70 or 80-year-old woman, but maybe more like a woman in her 40s or even 30s.
Right. Wasn't the average age 35?
Well, Ruth had been married to her first husband for 10 years, right? I
was going to say that we need to bump that up a little bit because she was married to Machlon for 10 years. So, and I don't think we want to dig too deep into sort of figuring out historical realities. Not that to say this isn't a historical story, but the story is not being told to get us to answer those questions.
It's being told to tell us that David is part Gentile.
It might be, I think, certainly a side effect of this story, and perhaps more intentionally to say this Moabitess woman is to validate that intermarriage, and in opposition to the post-exilic conversation going on in the post-exilic or about intermarriage, but read Ezra and Malachi and some of these other books. It has a place in that conversation.
It has a tremendous impact on my understanding of the word that is translated forever, la'olam. It's I'm not saying it right, la'olam.
Olam.
There's Moses gives a command that the Moabites were to be excluded from Israel, la'olam.
Yeah.
Translated in English as forever. And here we are just 2 generations later, and we're welcoming Naomi or Ruth into Israel as a Moabitess, and very conscious of her being a Moabitess. So La'olam is not what we think of in English as an infinite period of time, forever. It's just until the beginning of the next age.
Yeah, that's a very rabbinic type of interpretation, where I think you're right that it's related to Deuteronomy. This whole narrative has sort of that in the background. we can sort of read it together. And in many ways, like Ruth is being integrated. Ruth is becoming an Israelite. And even to the beginning where she was saying to Naomi, your people are my people. Like already, your God is my God. That's who I am now. So that it's not a story of syncretism. It's like the best way. But I think it does rub a little bit against the divine command to not marry, which is taken up later. It's really only probably taken seriously in the post-exilic period, though. Good. Other questions or comments about chapter 4?
Is it possible that verse 7 is a later editorial type insertion?
Okay, why do you say so?
The phrasing starts now in earlier times in Israel.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's definitely a signal that this is like a parenthetical phrase,
Yeah.
right? Dear reader, you don't do this any longer. Take off the sandal. This isn't the
Right.
custom any longer. But this is the way it was back then. I don't
Right.
think it's possible that it's a later edition. My view is that it's part of the story, that the story is not written in the time of the judges, right?
Mhm.
I think the story begins with way back in the time of the judges, a sense of a long, long time ago. And this is part of the narrative, so that this is the author's voice to the readers. So it steps out of the kind of the temporal frame of the narrative into the current stage. But it is taking a break from the narration time.
Yeah.
There are a lot of this verse is it doesn't even have the word for custom, and it has in this before in Israel, and clearly it is talking about a custom. So a lot of times that or something like that was supplied. And just this custom is interesting, right? Taking off a sandal, and it's a testimony, like a public testimony. It's almost like shaking on it. It's a way of making an agreement, but it's legally binding.
So that word that you're translating, it was a custom in the Lexham Hebrew English Interlinear, it translates it as two face, or two faces, maybe.
Yeah.
Is that a way that they say custom? Is two
No,
face?
so it's lepanim. Panim is faces, or it's actually just face, but it's used regularly with the lamed preposition to as just essentially a preposition of before. So the way I am supplying custom, that there's not really a word for that in the Hebrew. What there is, like, this was the custom before in Israel in an earlier time. So lipanim is probably something like in an earlier time.
Okay.
The other words are there, like in the exchange, to validate, confirm. And then you get at the very end the ha teudah, the testimony or the confirmation. So lots of legal language. One thing that Ruth doesn't have is sort of like divine command, law, Torah. I mean, everything coordinates, nothing's out of line with Torah, but it's not like they're citing biblical law in these matters. It seems like it's like throwing back to, I mean, of course, Torah happens, Sinai happens before Judges, but it's in the time of the judges judge, it's kind of a free for all. People aren't paying a whole lot of attention to Torah. So it's just customs and legally binding stuff, even when they're at the city gate and he's gathering the elders. You have to have these witnesses, and we're witnesses to this, and so on.
And the number 10 witnesses seem to be important to make a completeness. It strikes me as interesting that Boaz was able to get 10 witnesses to sit down, interrupt their day, and sit there.
Yeah.
Well, he gets another more, and finally collects 10 of the busiest guys in the village. He
Yeah.
gets them to sit.
Yeah.
He's got to be important.
Well, the gate is the place where there's a marketplace there, usually at the city gate. And it's also the place where people are meeting to make decisions. So maybe they all show up in the morning, like going to get coffee at Panera or something like that. And they all, they're there. This is their first meeting of the day for making some legal decisions, and then they go about other business. But yeah, it's just like he's just gathering people. He's like, hey, come on over here, Mr. So-and-so. And then the elders, the Ziknim. And then also there's like all the people. There's kind of a different category who are sort of standing beside and witnessing.
That's right.
Yeah, if you get a bunch of the city fathers together, there's going to be a crowd of spectators for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, something important's happening.
Right. Yeah. One, just for those of you who are interested in text critical stuff, there are some different ways of reading this for the sake of showing you what's going on. If you're looking at the Hebrew in verse 5, where I translated it as Boaz said, on the day of your acquiring the field from Naomi, also Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead one, you have acquired to raise up a name of the dead one over his inheritance. Now, I think that's the best translation of it, but it's a little out of line. There's an alternative way of understanding this. So the question is, why does Mr. So-and-so say at first, I will redeem, and then come back and say, oh, I can't do it, it'll ruin my inheritance. So what is it about what happens in between? And it's this verse. And so one interpretation is that if you translate it the way I did, then Ruth comes with it as well. And he knows that there's going to be a child if Ruth's involved in this. And that child will ultimately inherit whatever property is being acquired at this point. So it will ruin his own family's inheritance because it won't add any wealth to his own family by this right of redemption. So he's like interested in the land. But if Ruth's going to have a child, to raise up a name of the dead one, then it will ruin his own inheritance. Like, there's no real gain to it. I think that makes good sense. But another way of taking this is you've acquired the field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead one. So that Ruth, you're acquiring it from Naomi and Ruth. And I'll have a harder time explaining this view because I don't agree with it, but possible that Ruth is like the co-heir with Naomi of the land. The other weird part of this is the verb, if you're looking at the Hebrew, is kanita. In the Masoretes point this as a second person verb, you have acquired. In other words, on the day you have acquired to raise up a name of the dead one over his inheritance. The Hebrew actually has, the consonant actually has kaniti, I have acquired. So some would understand this as being when you get Naomi, I get Ruth to raise up the name. In other words, the child is going to be mine. Ultimately, the child, the land is mind then once Naomi dies. So the Masoretes correct this by putting in different vowels. They don't change the consonants. We call this a kativ kare. It's written one way, but we read it a different way. That doesn't quite make as much sense to me, but because it seems like the guy would know what's being added to it either way is Ruth. Ruth's part of the deal as well, whether she has to come be a part of his deal or somehow Boaz would acquire. But Boaz is making this deal in the first place because he has a right of redemption to Ruth. Anyway, just to say that's a confusing verse, and it's not quite clear what's going to bring ruin to the Redeemer's inheritance.
Would it have been a possibility that the potential baby, would have inherited all the rest of the property of Mr. So-and-so?
I think no. I think he would just inherit all the property of Elimelech, which no doubt was substantial. So rather than that property just being absorbed into Mr. So-and-so's ownership or being absorbed into Boaz's inheritance, it's going to stand on its own and eventually be given into Obed and his lineage, his family line. All of the families are allotted property, and that property is handed down from generation to generation. I suppose unless it just dies out. Richard?
This is from John Walton, not the rabbis,
Okay.
but he observes that there would be costs to taking care of the family, both the wife, any children, and improving the land from whatever state it's in. And he's not going to get the return on that land. That's going to go out to the other line.
Yeah. Right. So it's going to cost him money, but he's not going to see the return on that for himself or for his own children.
Exactly. Now, I have a question, because this is that piece I was going around trying to nail down, but this is all about preserving the name of the dead man.
Yeah. Right.
But outside this chapter, we don't. I mean, we have Mahlon mentioned once before, but this is the place that Mahlon was the dead husband of Ruth. I mean, like, his name's really not preserved in any of the lineages. It's it's Obed, the son of Boaz. And so, like, what's it doing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, Machlon, we only know that Machlon's the one married to Ruth and not Chilion because of this chapter where it's almost like a side comment. And right before that, you have Elimelech, right? In this chapter, but in the genealogy, it starts with Obed, which, it actually doesn't start with Obed. In the genealogy itself, these are the generations of Peretz. So it's like skipping down to this, but then you get, let's see, Boaz. I mean, it's really Boaz's line. It's not Elimelech's line, because Boaz, his father's name was Salmon, right? So it's like it somehow is. You're right. This story is all about raising up the name, I think, of Elimelech, also Machlon, the guys who died at the beginning of the story, and reviving that line. But then when you get down to the actual genealogy, it's about true fatherhood, I guess, about begetting. Boaz is truly he's the natural father of Obed.
Right.
Machlon.
But
Somehow,
I mean, no, my inclination, I read preserving the name, is thinking, okay, well, there's this legal fiction that even though the DNA came from some,
Yeah.
you know, the male relative, that the legal fiction is that it's the dead man's son or daughter.
yeah, I think that's true. Even though like the genealogy doesn't really express that. But I think it is the point of this story, that just as it comes back to Naomi, almost essentially being the mother of Obed, the dead one is essentially the father of Obed. Even though in reality, it's DNA wise, it's Ruth and Boaz. So
It doesn't really feel like a fiction if their focus is on the glory. The glory is being given to Mahlon and it is. They're in the most widely published book in all of history. They get a glory by the story of Ruth being written here for us. If their focus is on the pride, the glory, not on the DNA, I think this is a very valid statement. He is being preserved in the story.
yeah, but I see also Richard's point that there is a distinction between what a genealogy is doing and what a story is doing, and kind of highlighting the different points. And also it's sort of, when you say the dead one, Hamate, it's interesting not to raise up a name, doesn't name that person. It could be Elimelech, it could be Machlon, but it's kind of about the line, the family heritage more so. It's not quite like not intentionally non-naming like Mr. So-and-so was, but there is a kind of, it's interesting that they don't, to raise up the name of Elimelech, like they could have said that and they didn't. So there's a generalization of it, but certainly the story is, I mean, an important, it does raise up Elimelech's name in some way.
Is there a chiasm at play here that may affect that as well?
Yeah, where do you see that?
I don't know the Hebrew enough to be able to see it, but I don't know if I know like I guess there's one website that makes chiasms. It shows chiasms of pretty much every book of the Bible. But I didn't know if that may have been in play here as well.
Right. So chiastic structure for the whole book. Is that what? So yeah. Chiasms are tricky because they are there throughout the Hebrew Bible. And yet, if you start looking for them, you're going to find them, right? So sometimes they're not actually there, but you can find one. I do think there's sort of a coming back to the very beginning of the story here, where you have the story begins with, Machlon, Kilion, Elimelech, and then it sort of ends, and it begins with Naomi as the main character, and it ends with Naomi as the main character. And in between, you have sort of the Ruth and Boaz. I think of Ruth like a play, where you have different stages, scenes of, you have the Moabite fields, you have the path, the transition from Moab to Bethlehem when Naomi's talking to Orpah and Ruth. Then you have Bethlehem and the Boaz's field. And then you have the threshing floor. And then we're back to more of and then we go to the city gate. So it's not really back to anything spatially, but I could see, I don't think there's probably an intentional chiasm here, but there is a kind of a going back to the beginning in a sense of like, who's the focus of the story. Yeah, good. We have like 5 more minutes. Any other burning questions or observations? Mark?
Sort of interested in stepping back a minute at the way the books are organized. If you're reading your English Bible, of course, Ruth follows Judges, which makes sense. If you're reading your Hebrew Bible, then Ruth follows Proverbs, in particular, chapter 31, the worthy woman.
Yeah.
And then if you keep reading after Ruth, you're into Song of Solomon. So you have like 3 straight books, prominent women, strong women characters. I don't know what to make of it, but it's a contrast in the two.
Yeah. So I do think there's intention by somebody out there to put Ruth after Proverbs. On the one hand, and in the earliest time, they're dealing with a bunch of scrolls that are not ordered. Like once you only really have a sense of order once you have at least between like Proverbs and Ruth, let's say, once they're put into a book. And not every book has Ruth following Proverbs once they're like kind of a codex. However, I mentioned this whenever we got to the Eshet Chayil, Ruth being the woman of valor. It's the only other time that phrase is used is in Proverbs 31. And Ruth, if you take that as a clue that Ruth is sort of a demonstration of a hero, essentially, a female hero. And if we understand Proverbs 31 as being sort of a female hero, then clearly Ruth is not wealthy like the Proverbs 31 woman is. It's just about character. And then you get Boaz being a Gibor Chayil, right? We've talked about like them being this Chayil power couple of Ruth and Boaz. And then we get to in chapter 4, I didn't mention this, but toward the end of verse 11, when the elders are speaking to Boaz, and they're blessing him by the Lord, and we're blessing Ruth as saying, may her household be like the household or be built up like Rachel and Leah built up their household. And then in the middle of that, it says, and make a chayil, or do chayil, same word as the woman of valor, the man of valor. And now what they're supposed to do together is produce valor. But this is a metonymy for the child. The child will also be a chayil here. And there's different ways of understanding this. Some take it as, even if you translate or look at English translations, the New American Bible and the KJV have do worthily. Our Revised Standard, I'm guessing the NRSV too, New American Standard, New JPS have achieve wealth. But it's really one of those places in Hebrew where it's pretty obvious that, what Boaz and Ruth are chayil, and what they're going to do together is chayil, this power or valor. And then immediately after that is name a name, or call a name in Bethlehem. So it seems to be directed at the child, to not just to name him, have a baby and name the baby, but what's associated with the baby is chayil. And then, there is perhaps something is to Song of Songs, which, there's a romance to Ruth, and it's a little bit more constrained than what we see in Song of Songs, but it is about male-female romantic relationships, and then it's followed up by this love poetry in Song of Songs. So on the one hand, they're all unique, separate writings. They're not written together, but somebody put them in order, perhaps to draw out these connections.
Nice.
All right. Well, let me I haven't looked ahead. Just a logistical note on Hebrew Story Hour. We've been doing it the third Wednesday of the month, and the upside of that is that it's not so time consuming. The downside of that is that we've been reading Ruth for 4 months, but only a little bit at a time. There's not a lot of continuity. So it's about how I need to do it right now, but this is the end of Ruth. Richard, you mentioned you had a request for what comes next, maybe doing a Hebrew story hour, but if I remember right, that you might like to do a few poems. So I'll be announcing, if you're not on the Facebook group, I'll be announcing what we're doing next and when. Try to give you a little more notice than I did for this week. But if you have special requests, narratives or otherwise, let me know. All right, thank you all for your participation. Blessings upon your holidays.
Thanks for doing
you.
this.
Shalom.
Really enjoyed
Appreciate
it.
it.
Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.